Okay. Good afternoon, comrades. Let's greet Tango. I see Comrade Tango. I see Comrade Neil, and I see Comrade Jane is just joining now. And there are other comrades that are also joining on the panel. We have just started the broadcasting. And we have just started doing the live broadcast on Facebook. Welcome, comrades. Sorry for the slight delay. So we were trying to wait for people and also are trying to get ourselves used to this system. Just one ground rule, maybe if we can just, if we are not the one talking, if we can keep our mics muted so that it actually reduces the possibilities of feedback, and then when you have a chance to speak, then we will do so. We will then. I'm gonna give over to Comrade Musa, who's gonna start us and with the introductory stuff about this webinar. Comrade Musa.
Okay, greetings, comrades, and thank you for joining us again in our webinars, which we actually discuss broader macroeconomic issues, where we try to give alternative to the dominant neoliberal narrative that dominates our daily life. So as the Christian Institute, we have embarked on this webinars on economic transformation and broader macroeconomic issues to try and give progressive scholars and academics and comrades a voice to actually help us to try and work out alternatives to the dominant narratives. So we started last week with Comrade Rob Davis, who gave us an alternative on alternative towards a post COVID-19 and broader economic framework on the political economy issues. And then today we're having our second seminar, and we're grateful that everyone could join us today. And I'll hand over to Comrade Tembis, our director, to actually introduce our speaker for the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Musa. And so, as you mentioned, this is our second seminar in this series of webinars. So essentially, as Musa has just mentioned, these webinars are essentially a culmination of ongoing work that we have been doing with some of the comrades from the economic and social transformation cluster of the Communist Party and COSATU and other comrades as well, including some economists, some social scientists, in which we have been attempting really to coalesce a voice and thing that is going to bring alternative kinds of to really what is happening currently, obviously with the challenges of COVID-19, but very much framed around our understanding that while it is true that the pandemic is actually bringing, expanding the kinds of the crises that we are having, but we are very much with an understanding that the genesis of our specific crisis, particularly in the South African economy, do not just emanate only from the pandemic, but are more structural around the nature of our economy. And I mean, statistical figures, they show over the last, I mean, from the 2008, how the economy has struggled. We have had 2 consecutive technical recessions, both in 2018 and 2019, constant growing unemployment from 27% for 27.6 in 2018 to 29.1 in 2019, rising inequality, and so our understanding that COVID essentially only just accentuated a structural crisis. And so the response is not just about responding to COVID, but essentially requires probably a structural response to really transform the nature of our economy. And so last week we started with a session that was presented by Comrade Rob Davis, and in which presented a much more broader macroeconomic framework around how really do we, the kind of an analysis essentially that begins to bring both a comprehensive but also a more fuller framework, an historical framework that shows the relationship between even the crisis of the pandemic to the crisis of the economy, but also to the broader crisis of how capitalist accumulation produces these kinds of problems and continues to produce them. And so why then this needs the kinds of responses, both in terms of the health, but also even in terms of the economy. So today we have a pleasure to have Comrade Redge Nkosi, and Comrade Redge is the executive director and the research head of the First Source Money, and which is essentially a research organization that they do work on finance, macroeconomic policies, and those. And so he's gonna give us a presentation, and essentially the structure that we are gonna follow today is that Comrade Redge will give us his presentation, and then we will open for the questions, and hopefully then open for the discussion. And the format that we will take essentially is that we will have questions emanating from comrades that are part of the panel here, but also we will also have Comrade Tebogo, Comrade Tuva, Comrade Noktula, and Comrade Amilcar helping us to actually also track the questions that are going to come from the comrades who are following us from the Facebook live stream, and also so that we can really make the discussion as much broader as possible. And so without further ado, I would like us to give over to Comrade Redge to give us his presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Comrade Stay and Comrade Musa and the rest of the comrades. Thanks for inviting me to give a short lecture on macroeconomic issues, given our state of affairs in the country, and indeed given the COVID-19. I have a few slides, just about 4 or so. I thought perhaps we could start there. But before I go there, some 2 days ago, as all of us are aware, we're commemorating the calamity that happened so many years back, sparked by the gallant youth of this economy, of this country. The youth of 1976 are perhaps occupying serious positions both in government and industry as we speak. Some are among us right now, but the youth of today, if we look at it clearly, are the youth who are very, very much unhappy. If unemployment is in the regions of over 50% for the youth, then frankly, the youth of 1976 need to think quite clearly as to what to do to help the youth of today. It's not exactly what the youth of 1976 thought would be happening, but sadly, this is what we have. Now, some people may argue that monetary policy is at the center of the challenges that we find ourselves with. And whether that is correct we're going to have a look. But before also I start that, maybe also it's important to just broadly thank the Chris Hani Institute for hosting this webinar. Right, so, okay. I'm trying to get the slide on. Okay. Okay. Right. Colleagues, I asked a question whether, in fact, monetary policy is perhaps also one of those policies that should be helping out the youth today. For me, frankly, the truth is monetary policy is at the center of some of these challenges that we find ourselves in. Now, I would like to open it up with a quote from one of Harvard's eminent teacher of economics, John Kenneth Galbraith. He says the study of money above all other fields in economics is one in which complexity is used to disguise truth or evade truth, not reveal it. Well, it's a self-explanatory quote, but what is surprising, the professor is saying that the complexity of this particular area of economics does disguise truth or evade truth. Could it be that some of the monetary policy thinkers or monetary authorities be disguising truth or evading truth, not revealing truth? We do not know. But anyhow, as we go forward, let's first see what monetary policy is supposed to be, a definition. Well, as you read the monetary policy is obviously that aspect of the macroeconomic policy used by the central bank to manage, and I put in brackets, control money supply and the interest rate. The other part that is in brackets there with a view to ensuring price stability and general trust in the currency is added because it does extend in some way to that. But what does it mean if they say monetary policy is about the control of money supply and interest rates? That effectively in economics, for economists who are here, they think the Reserve Bank has the capacity to control the flow of money in an economy, and obviously to control interest rates. I think the interest rates that's referred to here are the short-term interest rates, not the long-term, because that is supposed to be endogenous. So by them saying the Reserve Bank controls money supply, effectively they're saying money is endogenous. But whether that is the case, frankly, is a matter of contention. But many of us from post-Keynesian schools, heterodox school, think money is actually endogenous, not exogenous. So money cannot be controlled by a central bank at all. But what exactly is money? Again, in economics, serious economists say money has not been defined at all. We know when you get to matric, get to first year university and so on, we are told that money is the store of value, medium of exchange, and so on. But those, frankly, are the uses of money, not the definition of money. Today, I heard the governor talk about the definition of money being the M0, M3, and so on and so forth. Well, actually, that also is not truly the definition of money. If money was defined properly, we should have been able to model it out quite clearly. And as we know, most economists know, there was a breakdown of the money demand function when trying to model the quantity equation. velocity has been declining, and money which was seen to have a stable relationship with GDP, unfortunately has been found to be unstable. So money basically hasn't been defined. So what should we be saying monetary policy is if money has not been defined? It is a debate in economics. Most economists on the right continue to think money is a mere veil. Meanwhile, economists on the left think money is the it. All monetary economies must use money if they are to function. Meanwhile, on the right, they say, well, money is a mere activity on top of real exchange. But whatever the contradictions that are there, life goes on nonetheless. And monetary policy is being conducted the world over. Now, traditional monetary policy gives us a role of what monetary policy is. It includes the promotion of economic growth, achieving full employment, smoothing business cycles, preventing financial crises, and stabilizing long-term rates, and of course, real exchange rate as well. But as you will see, those are the traditional roles of monetary policy. It seems quite clear that not all these objectives are consistent with each other. If we look at the current mandate of the Reserve Bank, which is the price stability, it's quite frankly not consistent with any full employment at all. If it's not consistent with full employment, should it be that then the Reserve Bank is partly to blame for high unemployment if it pursues price stability? These are some of the questions that economists have been asking and continue to ask up to date. And therefore, the choice of any framework, like the inflation targeting framework, is not one that must be must be picked up just because, for example, we see it being done in the UK or in Zimbabwe or in Botswana. Should be consistent with the domestic circumstances. And if in 1994, if in 1996, if in 2000, if in 2020, the domestic circumstances dictate that unemployment is the key challenge of the economy, and then South Africa chooses price stability as its mandate, would that then perhaps not tell us that price stability or the choice is to continuously produce high unemployment, since price stability is inconsistent with full employment? However, where we think about it, it's important that I think those charged with monetary policy, those charged with macroeconomic policy, need to organize themselves with a view to supporting their country, consistent with the challenges that exist in the country. We know in Asia Pacific, for example, inflation targeting wasn't the framework. Quite clearly, because in their mind, or in those countries' understandings, the understanding was that inflation targeting is not going to support the domestic circumstances or the domestic challenges or the domestic goals they thought are important for their countries. However, in South Africa, we did choose price stability as the mandate for our Reserve Bank. Now, inflation targeting since 2000, that's when we introduced in the country, I think. But even before then, there were some elements of inflation targeting. I personally, and indeed a number of persons, think the adoption of inflation targeting was not based on domestic considerations at all. Like I said, in 1994, 1993, in 2000 up to date, our fundamental challenges that we confront or confronted us then remain unresolved. And those are unemployment, economic and industrial growth, basically structural transformation, poverty, and inequality. Instead of picking up a framework that would be consistent with the need to reduce unemployment, South Africa found itself choosing inflation targeting, which, as we know, is inconsistent with unemployment. Now, if the adoption of inflation targeting is not based on consideration, on that domestic consideration, what was it based on? And why was it based on those aspects that we based our decisions on? Just below there, you see the phrase above centered on loanable funds theory. South Africa today, perhaps even 1994, 1996, when GEA came in, has the following understanding about money, all about economic development generally. We assume that for a country to develop, we need savings stashed somewhere from where investments are going to be made, and therefore economic growth and industrial development. And since South Africa is known not to be a country with lots of savings, the need for importing capital was deemed to be very, very crucial. Therefore, the global movement of capital in the 1990s and the need to stabilize the prices of that capital, particular capital that comes in. If it comes in at 2 rand, it must go out at 2 rand, perhaps even better. The idea then was for us to attract as much foreign capital as possible for us to develop, invest and then develop. But also one of the reasons for choosing inflation targeting was because thinkers or economists use a phrase called time inconsistency, sometimes also called dynamic inconsistency. Well, this in short would be a case where the politicians want to ramp up output when it is about election time. You know, in the meanwhile, with that ramping up of output, inflation jumps up. And therefore, people thought that, well, for us to prevent this type of action, inflation targeting would discipline the country or politicians or even the workers at the reserve banks not to follow a system where they're just going to inflate up the economy and have inflation rising. So inflation targeting was therefore chosen as a consequence of some of these. Of course, there are quite a few others. And they thought a rule-based system would be very, very important for South Africa. Now, the design, therefore, of our monetary policy is one which requires, of inflation targeting, is one that requires a fairly independent reserve bank. The independence there is known to be instrument independence, but not, of course, goal independent, because goal is set up by the government. How to implement the instruments to use are those that are determined by an independent reserve bank. Another key design on inflation targeting, if you're going to have it, is to ensure that you have a capital account that's fairly open, a liberalized capital account, and of course it requires a floating exchange rate regime. But that is what we found as useful in this country, and hence where we sit today, I think. The outcomes, in my view, are quite clear. If we thought inflation targeting is going to help us stabilize the currency, the question that you ask is the currency, or has the currency been stable since 2000 when we put inflation targeting as a framework? People crunching numbers tell us the currency actually has not been stable. What about the benefits of a capital account? Do we see any benefits in this country of a capital account? Many people will say, well, we do not know whether in fact there have been benefits of a capital account. We have seen the volatility of the currency. We have seen low investments in the country as a consequence of having adopted inflation targeting. I actually call it is in fact an interest rate policy. So it seems South Africa, since the adoption of this particular framework, has only reaped the industrialization. And we know the investment that has been coming in the country has largely been the hot money. So the attraction of foreign money has ended us up in the situation where we find ourselves 3/4 of the money that has been coming in, or 3/4 of what we call investment, is actually hot money. The economy is financializing at a pace that's quite fast. And as we know, the higher an economy gets financialized, the less it industrializes. Studies reveal that any economy that goes beyond 7% in terms of financialization, that economy begins to suffer, begins to reduce the economic air necessary to develop. South Africa, therefore, or the conduct of monetary policy in this economy, in my view, has reaped us all the challenges that we find ourselves with. But one may say, well, what about fiscal policy and other policies? Of course, they're important. South Africans have come to hear quite often by the governor, many scholars and so on, that monetary policy alone cannot lift this economy up. Well, yes, it is indeed true. A set of policies have to work coordinatively together, but also untrue in the sense that monetary policy as practiced in this country is actually, frankly, not the real monetary policy. It is an interest rate policy. Evidence shows that there's no country that ever developed. We have no history of countries having developed to the level where we see Japan, where we see South Korea, to have used interest rate policy as their major tool. Monetary policy, yes, but not interest rate policy. Interest rate policy is just a component, it's just one aspect of the monetary policy. Now, the question that we have to pose is, what happens from here? If the interest policy has given us volatility in the rand, no investment at all, currency that's actually not stable, and hot money that's moving up and down without benefiting the economy. We find ourselves in an economy that is suffering and continues to suffer hysteresis. Where do we go from here? Earlier on, I indicated that M0, M1 up to M4, sometimes M3, depending which jurisdiction you're in, is regarded as money or money supply. Actually, I call those a savings supply, not money supply. It's money that is not in use, that is money parked in banks and other financial institutions. And I also said that any monetary policy that we have to put in place has to be consistent with the domestic challenges or domestic circumstances. I feel if we're going to have to develop South Africa differently, it's important to observe what our key goals are or objectives as a country. And since 1993, that's when the RDP came out actually, or they were writing. The goals of South Africa then and today remain simple and straightforward. We have come to know them. The creation of employment, industrial and economic growth, the removal, if not the reduction of poverty, and many other developmental challenges. Therefore, if monetary policy is going to work at all, it has to be a policy that seeks to assist the promotion of the creation of employment and the promotion of economic growth. Therefore, a central bank mandate, and indeed the goal, must be consistent with the national goals. I submit to you that inflation targeting is not consistent with the national goals. Some people argue that it does create an environment wherein investment comes in and growth does come in as well as a consequence of that. Well, if that were the case, then frankly, we should have had investment in the country coming. The only investment that we see, as I said, is hot money. That's exactly what we do not want, financializing our economy. Therefore, macroeconomic policy, or say monetary policy, must aim at unemployment and, of course, economic growth, or what we sometimes, economic and industrial growth, what sometimes we call structural transformation, transforming our economy from where it is as a mining economy or as a primary producer to a high value producer. Our monetary policy, therefore, must be those that mirror what we see as traditional objectives of monetary policy. I mentioned earlier, which is full employment, smoothing business cycles, and low rates. Now, if that is the case, how could it be designed then? Is the current design of macroeconomic institutions consistent with this view? I beg to differ that, and in fact, almost reject the notion that the way in which our Treasury, our Reserve Bank are organized, that organized purely on the understanding of how inflation targeting is supposed to work. There's a great deal of compartmentalization among macroeconomic institutions. While independence of the Reserve Bank is certainly important, but the manner in which we've come to understand the workings of the Reserve Bank vis-a-vis the workings of Treasury, there's a turf wall, if you want, between them. So effectively, they're not working as a coordinated unit to deliver macroeconomic policy. Macroeconomic policy, macroeconomic itself is supposed to work very closely together. However, the institutions as they stand do not. And to the extent that they do not, we obviously suffer the consequences for that. Therefore, I recommend that the institutional design must be one where there's no compartmentalization between fiscal and monetary policy. And after all, fiscal policy hardly works if monetary policy is cast completely outside it. While obviously a rule-based system is important, discretion must necessarily also come into play. I advocate a case where the current 6 or 7, or rather 6 big banks that are the transmission belts for monetary policy as highly insufficient, and one requiring rather to have public monetary policy infrastructure. But what do I mean when I say public monetary policy infrastructure? Here I mean that for a country to succeed, for monetary policy to be effective, we need a network of public financial institutions through which monetary policy should travel, should be conducted. Public banking system, as is the case in countries like China, in countries like Germany, or including the US as well. India is one of them. So without that public monetary policy infrastructure, it's not very easy for one to carry out monetary policy. One of the reasons why we failed to industrialize here is because our 6 key banks are averse to risk, so much so that they cannot easily lend to a good chunk of the population. A good chunk of the SMEs are shied, in fact, by these big banks. And if that is the case, the question is, how then can industrialization take place? When in fact the selection becomes a very tough one. And I also think that the capital account, as we see today, is inconsistent with industrial development. We cannot be allowing money to flow in and out as if the flows of in and out generate any meaningful investment in the economy. It doesn't. But before I go down to the instrument, above there, I write that center South Africa's design and conduct monetary policy on credit theory. What does that mean? Earlier, I indicated that the inflation targeting system and matters that flow from it, things like attracting foreign investment and so on, are based on the understanding that a country requires savings for it to invest and therefore develop. Credit theory suggests differently. Credit theory suggests that a country does not necessarily need foreign money to invest. Credit theory suggests that credit can be created by banks, and banks are the creators of money supply, and therefore the creators of money for investment. It's not necessary for a country to go out and borrow money from Europe and elsewhere when it has a network of domestic banks, because each bank is a creator of credit. Each bank is a creator of money. To the extent that banks create money, the necessity for us to have a capital account open actually ceases. We can easily manage a capital account to the point where we do not see the movements of money up and down the manner we've come to see right now. So credit becomes the fundamental instrument unlike today, interest rate, which is the key instrument on inflation targeting, when it comes to real monetary policy, credit becomes the fundamental instrument. Of course, rates do matter, but they perhaps occupy a second or third rung in importance. It's only credit, not rates, that are so critical for development. In this instance, I call for the use of the balance sheet of the Reserve Bank as a primary monetary policy tool. But what does that mean? The Reserve Bank be responsible for the issuing of credit, not only to government, but to industry as well, including the SMMEs, especially given the fact that our banks are incapable of generating sufficient credit for the rest of the economy. Now, since we're at Chris Hani Institute, it was also necessary to remind that as a Marxist, Karl Marx did remind us in 1887 that credit whose volume grows with the growing volume of value of production is what is so important for any economy to develop and therefore advance. A new monetary policy regime for me should not target inflation, rather should target the entire yield curve. Of course, targeting employment or unemployment, if you want, is also equally important. But having to target inflation, frankly, runs counter to the issues we've just said right now. So this, to me, becomes the core of monetary policy, the design of it, and the instrument that has to be used. A monetary policy that has to be applied in any developing country, and South Africa indeed being one. Without this arrangement, it's unlikely that South Africa can achieve any development at 6.2. In closing, therefore, gentlemen, I just wanted to bring to you a few words about what the governor said earlier today. Consistent with inflation targeting, consistent with the idea that South Africa requires savings or is low on savings, the governor ended up telling us that, well, it is indeed acceptable for the IMF to lend us money, or for South Africa to go out and get money from the IMF, because according to him, we do not have savings from where to tap. And if the government was to go borrow on the market, then quite frankly, what's going to happen there is that interest rates are going to shoot up because we do not have enough savings in the country. And all the savings, according to the governor, will be taken up by the government borrowing. Therefore, the need for loans from the IMF, the World Bank, or foreign loans is very much important. Well, it is commonly understood in the country that indeed savings are low, but it's not true that we need savings for this country to invest. And therefore, the statement that we should be going to IMF and World Bank is frankly an old type of thinking that's not needed in the country. And therefore, it seems to me that the governor still, or the Reserve Bank as a whole, still thinks that we're living in a world of 1971 and before, the gold standard era. Frankly, we don't need the IMF. The governor went on to say quantitative easing. He claims he's not doing quantitative easing, actually, and he says if he's to do it, then we require rates to be at zero, inflation rates or interest rates to be near zero. Well, again, just a matter of clarification, I've written a bit about this. Quantitative easing does not require rates to be zero. And quantitative easing is beyond the purchases of government bonds that we've come to see the government purchase, the Reserve Bank purchase. Quantitative easing actually is the use of credit. It's the expansion of credit to the productive sectors of the economy. We also learned that monetary financing or direct financing of government, of the Reserve Bank to the government will be inflationary. Well, again, the models I think the governor is using, they're fairly antiquated. Professor Marikani not long ago gave us examples of countries that have been financing their governments directly, Guyana being one of them, Malawi, and a few other countries, not just here. But we know the UK is financing its government. The UK Reserve Bank is financing its government through its Ways and Means account. It's not the first time they've been doing that for quite a while. India uses its Ways and Means account to finance, the Reserve Bank of India uses Ways and Means to finance the Indian government. And so many other governments have been and continue to support, to draw from their reserve banks directly. And to suggest that financing government to be inflationary is quite frankly not true. You also remember that the government of Canada for over 40 years used to be financed by the Reserve Bank of Canada. In Australia, the same thing. So financing of governments by the Reserve Bank, especially if that money goes to the productive sectors of the economy, is hardly inflationary. However, it has become routine in this country that we have the governor telling us, or not just the governor, the entire Reserve Bank actually, saying that we cannot do QE because QE is inflationary. All these issues run contrary to the models of QE, even to the models of financing, of direct financing of governments by reserve banks. It should be dismissed, I think, with the macroeconomic contempt it deserves. My closing remarks, though, are just these few quotations here. I did make a quotation at the beginning of the discussion from an academic, but I thought it's important to reiterate what politicians have had to say about credit. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you've seen that. The governor, the President Abraham Lincoln categorically says that public enterprise need to be financed by state. And the question that arises from this is, are we doing that in this country? Would President Abraham Lincoln been sort of a dreamer who doesn't understand, who never understood money, or never understood banking? Lionel Mackenzie King, Canadian longest serving prime minister, like I said earlier, 40 years of financing government by the Reserve Bank, and once again, insisting that the control of credit by government is so fundamental, without which the parliament and the democracy we claim to have is idle and completely futile. Ladies and gentlemen, those are my views, my observations. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Comrade Redge, for the presentation, and quite a bold one, I think, and also quite interesting. And so, what I'm going to ask us to do essentially is maybe first to just allow clarity questions, if there are any, before then we can go to more substantive questions that are more towards the discussion. And so if there are any clarity questions, please, for those who are here on Zoom with us, you can either just raise your hand for those who are on the panel list, and for those who are participant list, you can actually write them down there on the Q&A. And also I will ask then the comrades Deboho, Noktula, Tsuva, and America, just to check if we have any questions that are clarity ones, and comrade things that are on the Facebook, on the Facebook platforms. So firstly, from the comrades who are here, anyone who has any clarity question? I don't see any hands. I just see a comment by Comrade Rasikan, excellent presentation, Comrade Redge. Comrades, are there any questions for clarity that are being asked from the Facebooks, either from the CHI or even from the SACP ones? Oh, yes, Comrade, thank you.
Okay. There is a question coming from the YCL Facebook page, and it's asking, how should the monetary policy relate to the NTR?
Okay. Thank you, Comrade Thanks. Do you want to attack that one, Comrade Redge, maybe directly?
Okay. Well, there's nothing as important as monetary policy in ensuring that the democratic revolution is executed in the manner we have always wanted to be. You know, those of us who are old enough to remember East Asia that we currently admire, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and so on, were in fact poorer than South Africa not long ago. It's fundamentally because of the use of the monetary policy that those economies developed to the level they are today. It was at the center, monetary policy was the center of development. Their reserve banks were so active in the economies. Today, China, as we speak, a great deal of the development that we see in China is because of the key hand of the Reserve Bank, and therefore the monetary policy. Therefore, our democratic revolution is going to be stillborn, completely stillborn, if we're not going to activate our Reserve Bank to play the role that all monetary policies have played in entire East Asia, in Europe, and the Americas itself. So there is a direct relationship between monetary policy and the revolution that we talk about. And without a key hand by a reserve bank, without a key hand by the monetary policy itself, we can be rest assured that this is going to be a dream deferred. So I frankly see that there is indeed a very high link. Look at unemployment right now. If the country is unable to target unemployment because we think we have to target inflation, but we know inflation is completely inconsistent with targeting unemployment. How are we conducting a revolution when we have millions and millions of our people in hunger and in poverty and without employment? So there is a very direct link between what we want to achieve as a country and monetary policies. But again, we must remember that what we are having here in this country is not monetary policy. It is interest rate policy. And never in the history of economic development have we ever known a country that has developed by simply lowering or upping the interest rate. There's, after all, no difference between us and the US because they do the same. Us and the UK, they do the same. Us and Zimbabwe, they do the same. An active hand, active monetary policy is so important for any revolution that a country seeks to wage. So yes, there is indeed a link. Thanks, Comrade Chang.
Thank you, Comrade. Thank you, Comrade Redge. I see Comrade Jenny also has a hand raised. Yes, Comrade Jenny.
Thank you, Comrade Skambisa, and thank you, Comrade Redge, for an extremely interesting and thought-provoking and alarming presentation. For me, you focused our attention very clearly on the policy contradictions between our national goals, our industrial policy action plan, and the functioning of the Reserve Bank and their particular way of managing the decisions that fall within their ambit. What I think would be very useful for you to condense for me and is to what extent is it the model of the Reserve Bank that needs to be changed in order for us to be able to address that policy contradiction? Because when one lands up with one part of the state is developing policy in line with national goals, and one is being, that very policy and the ability of that policy to achieve those goals is being undermined by another instrument, what's the mechanism out of it? So I think for me, it's a major challenge for us as the left in South Africa to use this opportunity in COVID-19 as we're talking about a new economy, as our recovery program coming out of COVID-19. What do we need to be able to do differently in terms of the institutions so that we don't land up with this policy contradiction that is crippling the ability to deliver on the national goals? Thanks.
Thank you, Comrade Jenny. Comrade Redge, there is also 3 other questions. Maybe let me just put them together. I see Comrade Rasigan also has a hand, as well as Comrade Alex. So I will have Comrade Rasigan, Comrade Alex, and then I will read the question that I found from the participants. Comrade Rasigan.
Greetings, comrades, and thanks very much, Comrade Redge. It really was an excellent presentation. In your presentation itself, it's quite apparent that you've presented us with this challenge of confronting a counterfactual. The Comrade Jenny mentioned it as a contradiction in policy. But I think from your presentation, you were quite clear that choices were made, and these choices then excluded certain possibilities. The focus on price stability over jobs was a choice. It is not then a contradiction of policy. And because of that, it exposes a flawed logic. Now, the empirical verification is 30 years, a generation of us not advancing. And this then tells us it has failed in practice. Comrade Redge, if you don't mind, I think I need to add a number. When we talk of 40.1% of people between 15 and 34 in South Africa not being in employment, education, or training, that's not just a percentage, that's 20.4 million people who are excluded from the productive forces. And if they're excluded from the productive forces, the quote you put from Marx is even more important, because through that, we cannot generate the credit necessary for us to reinvest in our economy, which is endogenous. And I think these are very clear points, and I'd really like the comrades to also build upon it. This critique is in time, but I also want to also add a slight variation. I don't think we need to bring in the viral vector of COVID-19. Those numbers that we speak about, Comrade Redge, were from the end of 2019. If we think of the real numbers now, it's an absolute catastrophe. And if we're going to be targeting that, we must be much more open to the alternatives you have suggested. So thank you very much. And thanks very much, Zitembiso.
Thanks, Comrade Rasigan. Comrade Alex.
Thank you, Comrade Ste. I wish to thank Comrade Redge for the presentation and completely agree with Comrade Rasigan. I was looking at Karl Marx's monetary theory, which he develops in chapter 3 of volume 1 of Capital, and in several other chapters of volume 3. There is something I find very interesting from the definition or the attempts on the definition of money presented by Comrade Redge in that regard. I will just ask him to elaborate on one of those, which perhaps it is not written down in those words, money as the universal equivalent. Because the theory, or Marx's theory of money as endogenous, it's very much rooted in his analysis of commodities and the value that is materialized in commodities. And he says that, like, you see, the value that is materialized or crystallized in a commodity, it's in a very big way what makes money to be endogenous. You said something that perhaps you cannot control 100%, because commodities enter the market with value. They don't enter the market without value. So the value is added in production. And money mediates the equivalent in the exchange value of commodities. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because there is something fundamental in your presentation. Marx says that the central bank is the pivot of the credit system. Together with Frederick Engels in the Manifesto of the Communist Party, they say when the revolution has advanced and the working class has taken over, credit must be centralized in the hands of the state. And that is the working class organized as the state. Now, from your presentation, it comes out very clearly that we have this pivot of the credit system functioning through private commercial banks. And those private commercial banks are not there for national development goals. They are there for profit making, while they are part and parcel of the mechanism of money creation. And I use the term money creation in inverted commas. And I'm referring to the inverted commas because of my acceptance that of of labor as the source of value and of the theory of money as endogenous in commodities. So that is very critical. How can you, if I may return you to your answer on the revolution, how can you drive a revolution while the key instruments of driving that revolution are not in the hands of that revolution? I mean, the 4 to 5 to 6 banks that you referred to are commercial banks. And from as monetary channels or as monetary transmission channels, they are clearly not driven by a program decided by the state. I was looking at a report by the People's Bank of China. When it releases the money, it has several instruments and programs. It does tell the banks, this one, you lend it to this particular sector, and these are the terms of the lending. What you referred to as, it determines even interest rates across the yield curve. It says this money goes to cooperatives, and here are the terms. In our country, we do not have that. What do you think is the way forward?
Okay. Thank you, Comrade Alex. As I mentioned, there was this question, and then I'm going to give to Comrade Redge to answer this from Comrade Alfred Mafulega. He says, how can we get this out for our government to adopt this monetary policy as you suggest, Comrade Redge? Or perhaps what is holding it back from doing the reasonable thing on monetary policy? And then secondly, he also asked, and on this issue, and then he says, are we not cutting danger here, like the problems we see on our northern neighbor, where they seem unsure as to what currency they use or have? Please, Comrade Redge. Maybe let us deal with those with Comrade Jenny, the comment by Comrade Rasikan, and also the point by Comrade Alex, and the question by Comrade Alfred. Comrade Redge.
Okay, thanks, Comrade Stay. I was muted there. Very important questions. I'll start with the last one. Comrade Alfred, wondering how we can get our government to adopt this approach. I don't know. I must admit, I was a government worker myself since President Mandela's time until President Zuma. So I do have a sense, some sense, if you like, of the processes that a government can take. But at the same time, these processes can take quite a long time, but at the same time, they can take almost immediately if you want. I think as policy officers ourselves, as policy workers ourselves, we could put together a policy framework, depending, it could be a number of months, 3, 4, 6 months, and present it to our cabinet masters to say, this we think is consistent with our development agenda. Please look at it, and so on and so forth. Of course, the cabinet would look at it and throw it to parliament, and so, and things could move very fast. Now, the choices that we have made as government and the choices that the ANC or the alliance have made in the recent past have been either contradictory or interesting, all right? As we know, the ANC is supposed to be a leftist organization. The SACP is a leftist organization. ASO is So are all other alliance organizations like COSATU and SANC and so on. I'm not particularly sure what it can take, though, for our government to see that for the past 25 years, now 30 years, Rasgan almost says that, we have failed to even the simplest of things to advance from an industrial perspective, to dent unemployment. It was very easy, very possible for us to do that. I think if we had actually followed say, for example, the East Asians. Those are solid examples. You don't even have to go to a book. You have to go to them and ask what's going on. But let me then go back to Comrade Jenny, Rasigan, Alex, on the wonderful questions as well. Indeed, I see that some arms of state are undermining others in the conduct of the mandate. They're almost antagonistic, if you want. One is pulling this way, the other one is pulling the other side. You would ask Minister Rob Davis, for example, as the Minister of Trade and Industry, if he, let's just assume he's still the Minister of Trade and Industry. He's trying to industrialize, but is confronted with interest rates are fairly high, because someone wants to maintain interest rates so that they can attract, not what Mr. Davis, what Dr. Davis wants, industrial development, but it attracts hot money, right? But DTI minister wants a stable currency, all right? But when you attract hot money through the high interest rates, the currency begins to jump. We know that. So quite correctly, we have one arm doing this, another arm, or one facing this way, the other one facing the other side, yet of the same body. So it's a body that is a confused body, if you want. So we quite correct. We have elements within ourselves that contradict each other. And until we smoothen that through a very strong leadership call that seeks to say our goals are clear and simple. The RDP, go anywhere else, forget the NDP and anything, just go to the RDP itself, all right? All those goals remain valid today as they were in 1993, 1994. And to the extent that you say our goal is to remove unemployment that is so high, or to reduce unemployment is so high, why should you then have to bring in a policy aspect that seeks to grow unemployment, if you want? Frankly, it's quite disturbing. So Rasigan is correct in the sense that our choices, we had chosen to be contradictory. So I last year asked a question: is it incompetence? Is it capture, or both? I think all of us must find an answer between these three: capture, incompetence, or both. But quite frankly, there wasn't anything. There wasn't anything that made sense for us to adopt inflation targeting at all. Comrade Tito Mboweni was the governor of the Reserve Bank then, must remember in 2000, when we adopted this. There was a piece of, he wrote something there that he says, if there's any person, I picked it up from the Bank of International Settlements, he says, if there's any better system, then that person should go to him and tell him if there's any better framework than inflation targeting. But frankly, the question is, I mean, in 2000, the East Asians were growing without inflation targeting as a framework, the Asia Pacific. I mean, why should you even ask anyone as a governor or as a minister? You should just see what is happening in Asia. So it's quite frustrating, quite frankly, and it's something that we, I think, as a party, as communities, as an alliance, must seriously engage. That if we choose this particular framework, which obviously is going to undermine another framework, or is going to undermine the very goals we set in place, then frankly, we're not doing ourselves any favor. So indeed, Rasigan, 20.4 million people, I mean, young people, if you want, who were supposed to be celebrating or commemorating the 26th Soweto uprisings yesterday, are languishing without hope, in large measure because of us as not only workers of state, but as comrades who were young in 1976. So it's a failed policy, there's no doubt about it. And how on earth then do we want to continue with something that has failed? We want to go to IMF. And the governor, just hours ago, is saying because there are no savings in the country. I do not know where he gets that economics. It doesn't exist. We don't need anyone's savings. We don't need Europe. Asia rejected we quite clear. Japan, frankly, banned FDI. FDI I'm talking about first, not hot money, but FDI, all right? Japan banned FDI, Taiwan banned FDI, and many others. South Korea banned FDI because they wanted the economy to belong first to Koreans, first to the Japanese, first, before you can allow all these many others. Now, you calling for IMF money as a governor of the Reserve Bank, you should know how money is created. If we do not know how money is created and therefore how development can occur, then quite frankly, we're not fit for our positions. As deployees of the alliance, therefore, the alliance has to think about it very clearly. Because there cannot come a point when we have a revolution that we have caused ourselves. We are actually, in my view, brewing up a revolution to occur on us because of our actions. Comrade Alex, you know, Marx has left us with a great deal of work to sift through and get a sense of how we can migrate ourselves from the poverty, the misery that we have, to being a nation that celebrates advancement. The recognition by Marx of the Reserve Bank as pivotal, as center to any form of advancement is without doubt and remains solid. It was solid then as it is solid today. 1887, when the first English edition of Capital came out, issues there are as valid in 1880s as they are valid today. But we as Marxists, if you want, as communists or as socialists and so on, should know that we have guiding roads as in Marx in some of these issues. Not that Marx is correct in each and every aspect, but frankly, quite a number of areas is correct. So money is endogenous, okay? The Reserve Bank cannot control money all over. It can't, it just doesn't work like that. Even if books want to tell us like that, or Friedman wants to tell us like that. So if we are going to have to drive a revolution, for me, there ought to be a way in which the Reserve Bank is reorganized. Now, cutting across Jenny, Rasigan, Alfred, and Alex, I start from an institutional change. Because the institutional system that we have right now is inconsistent with the new monetary policy regime that I was trying to suggest. It's completely inconsistent. Because first and foremost, the regime I'm trying to put in place here does not accept this hot money that's coming from somewhere. It doesn't. Right? Yet, the models at the Reserve Bank, okay, the models at Treasury are consistent with inflation targeting, which is a financializing framework. So an institutional change has to take place. Now, what are institutions? Institutions, these are organizations that serve society. But within those organizations, there are rules that bind those the institutions. Now, these rules are tailored, if you want, towards an economy that is going to create unemployment. They're tailored towards an economy that is going to be deindustrializing for all the time. And unless that changes, quite frankly, the revolution is lost. And there can be no other important players than the grouping that's here in the Chris Hani Institute today or tonight that can begin to focus the attention of other leaders towards the reorganization of the institutional framework that governs this economy. And then this policy fits in quite properly, because this policy is going to be useless unless the institutions are changed. So to that extent, therefore, colleagues, Rasigan, Jenny, fundamental questions that we all must begin, I think, to migrate towards and realize that we don't have the time and we have no minute to buy. Comrade, stay.
Thank you, Comrade Redge. I had just written now that we are open for discussion. So anyone that either a question or even comment or some point that you want to generate an idea or to actually a thread for some discussion, please, they are welcome. And so you can raise hands or you can write on the Q&A for those who are not able to speak. Any contribution? I see Dr. Hatebe. Let's give Dr. Hatebe while we are waiting for others. Please mute, Doc. Please unmute.
Thank you. Just a short one, Comrade Redge. How do we fight the scourge of financialization? I think you mentioned it, it's a serious problem, but what policy measures can be put to fight that scourge, which is pervasive in almost all the countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Doc. Yes, Comrade Alex.
Yes, there is something I would like Comrade Redge to comment on, but I will make an input. After the 2009 elections, the working class in South Africa had critiqued the institutional model. By the institutional model at this time, I'm just leaving aside the rules. I'm just focusing at the organization of government. The main contention by the working class was that the National Treasury, actually the Department of Finance, and within it, the National Treasury had sort of become the prime ministerial department. And as a result of that, the Department of Economic Development was created. However, that department was not given economic policy formulation mandate and ended up being a department of some industrial policy interventions, working together with the Department of Trade and Industry. The Public Finance Management Act says that the National Treasury, as part of its powers and functions, will coordinate the implementation of government's macroeconomic framework. And I consider that wording to have been very careful, because it does not say the National Treasury will formulate macroeconomic policy. The wording in the Act says the National Treasury will coordinate the implementation of macroeconomic policy. I take that to have been a conclusion made after a consideration that macroeconomic policy or its formulation requires the whole of government departments working together, because each one of them have a role to play. One thing we have seen following the 2019 elections was the dissolution of the Department of Economic Development and its integration into the Department of Trade and Industry. The Department of Labor was given an additional mandate, at least in the new name that it acquired, the Department of Employment and Labor. Whether it was given employment, policy-making powers, we are yet to see. However, what happened in 2019 is that the National Treasury released the paper that it released in August 2019. Something funny happened there. That National Treasury was like making policy for all government departments, taking powers from government, instead of one hand fighting another. The National Treasury in that paper says, in communication, you will open up telecom infrastructure to exploitation by private sector companies. And it called that private participation and competition. In transport, you will do the same. In water, you will do the same. In this particular sector, you will do, several sectors were identified called the network industries. Now, my question is, or at least from where you stand, because I didn't see the cabinet working together. Just immediate, and the reason why I'm saying this is that immediately after that policy was released, the Minister of Employment and Labor was asked in Parliament what his views were regarding the labor market policies proposed in that paper. And he said, no, we will have to read it first. So in other words, you began to see the National Treasury even seeking to determine the labor policy. And in that regard, it said the national minimum wage that was agreed upon is a problem, and therefore compliance with it must be reversed. It should not be compulsory. Remember that the national minimum wage says if the employer is not in a position to pay, the employer must apply for exemption, and the exemption process requires scrutiny. So the National Treasury was saying that scrutiny is red tape. So it was making policy for all government departments. Hang on. What's your view about that? I do not agree with that. I did not see the other cabinet ministers asserting their policy-making powers. I saw the National Treasury being even consolidated as an overarching department that overrules the rest. And when you talk about financialization, I would perhaps propose that you look at that, at the financial, at the National Treasury, somewhere, somehow becoming the chief representative of financial interests in government and making use of those financial interests to seek to determine what must happen in the rest of government. For example, when the president now announced the COVID-19 package of 500 billion, he said this is just the first phase. The next phases will follow. The direction was somewhere about, a stimulus package reaching somewhere around, 1 trillion. The National Treasury just intervened. No. The reduction in interest rates by the Reserve Bank and the purchasing of government bank together total 800 billion. They even overruled the president. So I would like to hear from you whether you have the same observations, whether you have the same observations. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, Comrade Alex. Sorry. Before you answer, Comrade Redge, there's also a hand by Comrade Musa. Comrade Musa.
Okay, thank you, Comrade Redge, for a wonderful presentation. I just want to ask, and maybe it's like a clarity-seeking question on, and linking up to Dr. Hadebe's question on, why do you think there's this appetite of this financialization of the South African economy, which actually leads to deindustrialization and high levels of unemployment, as you've outlined? Why do our policymakers see the need for them to financialize the economy, which leads us to these high levels of deindustrialization and unemployment? As Comrade Rasigan has highlighted the figures of 24.4 unemployed youth in South Africa. Thanks.
Thank you, Comrade Musa. Before you answer, Comrade Redge, just to add one more thing, maybe not just for you, but I think for the discussion here, I am of the assumption that there is consensus of all of us here of the pertinent issues that are raised by Comrade Redge. And so maybe what is also, I think, important in expanding this discussion, it's actually what then are the actual concrete kinds of struggles that then are necessary, because from the presentation, even from the comments that have been made, Comrade Rasikan, Comrade Jenny, Comrade Alex, and everyone else, what seems clear is that the trajectory that we are having, it's a political trajectory, as meaning are decisions, political decisions by specific interest groups and specific hegemonies that essentially direct how things are, and so maybe then Comrade Redge can get us there. But I think to open it up to all of us, really, I think it is important. Can we enter that discussion then that in the current conjuncture and with the issues that Comrade Redge is raising and the consensus that we are having around these things, what then are the actual concrete kinds of struggles that then needs to be advanced and to be waged to essentially bring this voice to the fore and to, I suppose, to use a common cliche, in a way, change the balance of forces to actually bring the kinds of policy direction, but also institutional transformation that are really going to give rise to the kind of things that are necessary for transforming our economy. Comrade Redge.
Thanks. Thanks, Comrade Stay. Comrade Musa and Comrade Dr. Hadebe, thanks for what I see as trying to keep this thing out. You see, I'll start with financialization because it's common to two comrades there. Yep. Sorry. It's common to two comrades here. Why is there appetite for financialization, and how can we deal with it? It's very difficult for me to get a sense why there is in fact appetite for financialization. But what I know is about it and why it is creeping all around us is as follows. A while back in Europe, discussions had emerged as to the nature of the economy or the economies they were facing. And these discussions had started well before the crisis of 2007, 2008. And how then Europe can continue to sustain itself in a manner consistent with what they have become, what they had come to know as their good life. Now, the collapse of the economy in 2007, 2008 was a shock. And that collapse itself was, in a way, triggered by the very manner in which the economies were working. So when the collapse happened in 2007, around end 2008, Mark Carney, was it Mark Carney? He had just been appointed, I think. Mark Carney of the Reserve Bank of the UK chaired a meeting in Switzerland, a meeting that began to discuss how to reorganize the global economy. But in fact, it was about how to reorganize the European economy. And they then took the Bank of International Settlements. There's the Financial Services Board there. And it began to think of how to reorganize the new global architecture, financial architecture. And as they were meeting, it became clear that Europe seeks to continue the neo-colonial aspects of life, but not, of course, in Europe, but in the colonies Europe had during the past colonial times. It only emerged a bit later that when they appointed an eminent persons group and put that eminent persons group onto the G20 to devise a new global financial order, that we began to notice that Europe, and indeed the US, were seeking to ensure that the developing world, people like us, must continue to feed them in the manner we have been feeding them ever since they colonized us. But this feeding is not going to be a forced feeding like we were forced before. It has to be weaved from a financial system perspective. So therein arose the manner in which money from Europe will continue to enter Africa as if it's coming to develop Africa or the developing world, whereas in fact, it is entering as an exploitation tool to suck money out of Africa, out of the developing world, back to the colonizers or colonies. So, so the financializing aspect, which had begun a while back, intensified, therefore, immediately after the crisis. And many of the things that we witness today are a consequence of an approach by Europe and the West to ensure that the economic dominance that they have is sustained. Now, so what we are seeing now, people like ESCOM, all right, water, transport, and so on, where they talk of private sector participation or private finance intensifying in the manner it is, it's actually part of the architecture that has been drawn up. It's just intensifying today. The challenge, however, is it's not that we have not been seeing this thing ourselves. The Treasury, our Minister of Finance, if you want, and our Reserve Bank have been participating in these discussions in Europe. Discussions which are contrary to our developmental goals, contrary to our developmental ideals, contrary to the NDR, completely. But somehow, well, at least from my side, I'm not very sure of others, I never saw any paper or any comrade from Treasury or from the Reserve Bank addressing other comrades outside of their offices to saying, but we're under attack. Instead, what we've been seeing is, if you want, the assistance of the agenda put up in Europe to undermine the economies here in Africa and elsewhere. So financialization, therefore, is growing. And I'll talk to Alex paper and so on just now. But they're not just financializing the government or the state. They are financializing every aspect of our lives. That's why our policy space is narrowing every single time, while incapable of doing anything. Because from this side we have this, from this other side we have this. So effectively, all these, our options are narrowing every single day. Our choices are narrowing every single day, but they're narrowing not because we cannot do it. We can actually reverse them. But who should reverse them? The persons who have been attending those discussions should be the persons going to the alliance, because they're alliance kids, if you want, all right, to use that term. The deployees of the alliance, all right? They should be therefore warning the alliance to saying, there's this that is happening and so on and so forth. So the alliance begins to formulate policy against the very things that are intended to work against us. Now, You know, financialization is a big term. It hasn't received a formal definition, but we know what is actually happening. Part of the reason why we're industrializing is financialization is growing. Like I said, the more you financialize, the more you suck economic air necessary for industrial development. Right? Now, how do we de-industrialize, Comrade Khadem? I think it's your question. Well, earlier on, I mentioned of the inflation targeting as effectively a financialization tool, all right? But inflation targeting says you should open up your border of money flows, all right? Like I said the other time, it's like opening up a border between Zimbabwe and us. There should never be any person between at the Badbridge River. So Zimbabwe should flow in and out. I do not know whether that is acceptable to us, or opening a border between Maputo and Nelspruit. So inflation targeting has got all those. Inflation targeting is compartmentalizing the comrades, if you want. So a comrade at the Reserve Bank feels so important that we do not want to listen to a comrade at the Treasury, for example. So it's like, you remember the black on black violence at some point in time? All right. Some people told us we are fighting amongst ourselves, when in fact there's someone behind who is actually causing you and me to fight. So that the institutional setup of financialization is exactly as we have now accepted between Treasury, Treasury, the FSB, the Reserve Bank, DTI, and so on. All right? And money, therefore, is coming to destabilize the order that we seek to create. So one way of de-financialization is first to block the borders that are open, so are wide open. I mean, why is China industrializing? It's because they've closed the borders, isn't it? There's no money, any money flowing up and down in China. China chooses what money has to come in. You cannot just pick up money and say, you know, I have to do this and that. You have to have some order. And that begins to be a way in which we can start de-financializing our economy by blocking some of the issues that are consistent with this institutional system they set up for us. You must remember, we didn't put up the happenings that are there at the Treasury and the Reserve Bank. No, we didn't. No one would say that. There's no ANC man who put up that. There's no alliance men who did that. These things were taught to us by those people. So therefore, if I were to summarize on this particular matter, there's a way in which we can begin to change these institutions in the manner in which they're organized, set up, and the rules thereof. And also, when the president says blended finance is very good, blended finance is very good, actually it's not good at all. It has never been good. You know, if you want to find the definition of blended finance, it's there. It's bad definition. All right? And why should any one of us rejoice in blended finance? We shouldn't be. All right? I mean, Rothschilds, they wrote a letter to ESCOM to say they want to help them do this and that. We don't need Rothschilds to help us. ESCOM is us, it's not something somewhere, it's us. We don't need Rothschilds to help, we need to help ourselves. I think we can do that. Now, Comrade Alex, you raise an issue pertaining to many issues, but it centers around policy formulation at a macro policy formulation, if you want. There cannot be a single institution of state that is charged with formulating so a broad a policy regime as macroeconomics, a macroeconomic policy. It can't be possible. But then you have to understand what DTI wants to achieve. You have to understand what labor wants to achieve. You have to understand what energy wants to achieve. You have to understand what tourism wants to achieve. You have to understand what science wants to achieve, and so on and so forth. So it's a game of sitting on a high table, cabinet ministers saying, these are our goals, these are, and so on and so forth. Then policy formulation begins to emerge from that collective. Without that process being put in place, you risk some hot herd coming up with some document as how he understands macroeconomic policy. Look, for example, if you understand macroeconomic policy as decompartmentalizing the Reserve Bank and the Treasury and DTI and so on and so forth, where are you going to get with industrialization? You're not getting it. And we have hotheads like that. Supposing you understand your macro policy as saying we need savings, all right, to develop, to need savings for investment and therefore develop the country. Because you read that at your PhD level. But that's wrong. It doesn't matter whether you got it at PhD level or master's level or at a junior level. It's wrong economics. So it cannot be one single man just because he read it at PhD and he knows that savings are good for investment and therefore development. It's the wrong understanding of macro. And that's exactly what we're faced with now. I also had an opportunity to look at the Treasury paper. It also recommended that we should sell Eskom's power stations somewhere here. They had to change it because someone got a bit frustrated with such things. And I mean, how on earth can you begin to sell the infrastructure that is supposed to help you advance at a cheap rate, sell it, and then buy the same infrastructure at a higher rate? Frankly, it's a bit unusual, isn't it? So I think there was an error in that particular document. Secondly, that document has no basis in true macro at all. It has none. So to the extent that it is there, well, we have to accept, but frankly, it's a document having had a chat with so many people. They say, well, yeah, well, it's fine, it's there, but it's not worthy the paper is written on. Perhaps it is also from the fact that there wasn't much consultation around it. So I think that, you know, stories of 800 billion rands being the money that we have in the economy and so on, again, there's no such. We don't have such money. Analysis, economists have gone to analyze that money. It's actually not 800 billion rand. All this money that we are told of the Reserve Bank has released so many billions of rands into the economy. There's no money released in the billions of rands into the economy. However, I'm not particularly sure whether propaganda is also useful when we have to deal with COVID. I'm not very sure. I'm not used in the area of propaganda. But analysis tells us that there isn't much that's being said that's true. So it's frightening from financialization to macro policy that is not macro, to the resuscitation of this economy that is suffering from deep hysteresis caused because we failed to support the economy during crisis of 2008. I'm not particularly sure where we're going, but frankly, it's a very frightening situation to the extent that the Alliance has to have a very deep introspection about where we go from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Redge. There is a useful comment that is to be made by Comrade Rasigan, and then we are now in our last 5 minutes of the allocated time. Comrade Rasigan.
Thanks very much. And, thanks as well. As you were speaking, Comrade Redge, and also picking up on the discussion so far, I think it's quite important. There's a level at which we constantly be encouraged to be more concrete in terms of the proposals we make. But there's something that gets highlighted in your presentation, and I think also the resonance amongst all the comrades on this call, and that is about the intellectual capture that takes place when we are framed and locked into certain institutional choices, of which the logic is flawed. And it's precisely there that we need to advance much more carefully on breaking. We need to have a rupture. We can't continue within the same institutional frameworks, expecting different results. So I think it's quite critical in terms of us having to not only reinvent, reimagine those alternatives and put them into practice. Our ends and means can be consistent, and especially in the ecological framework, this pandemic, and a whole range of other challenges confronting us. We need to think more holistically and not revert back into these silos, no matter how tightly framed they are ideologically. So thanks very much, Comrade Redge.
Thank you very much, Comrade Rasigan, and thank you, comrades, for the really an illuminating discussion, and quite useful for those of us who are not necessarily economists, who just go over the surface to really get the kind of details that was advanced by Comrade Redge, and so we really do want to continue the discussions. We really do want to continue the engagements, and so for those who are following on Facebook, you can continue to make comments and questions even there, even for later, because as we mentioned last week, and also I mentioned earlier on, we are making these sessions a continuing engagement, and so next week Thursday we will have another session as well, and the following one, and so this is going to be a continuing engagement in which we are really trying to build this kind of momentum around how do we provide space for alternative thinking and really get kind of ideas that are really, as Comrade Rasigan was saying, a counter imagination, new kinds of imagination that enables us to see things that are beyond what we are told currently, that are the actual contours and are the actual boundaries of what we can do. And so there is more stuff that's going to come. And I am also happy to announce that we have a special session on this coming Saturday, the 20th, at 4 o'clock. And let me try and use this share screen thing so that I can see if I'm also as advanced as other comrades are.
Comrade, stay. Before you do that, can I just a word or two?
Yes, please.
In closing from my side, Comrade Rasigan used the phrase institutional framework. Standard macro answers to poor economic outcomes are that, well, the macroeconomic policy is wrong, all right? As we have just said here, macroeconomic policy is wrong. So that becomes the answer. And therefore, we have to correct the macroeconomic policy as we're seeking to correct now. In reality, if we correct the macroeconomic framework, the regime itself, without correcting the institutional framework under which this regime is going to be housed, the war, the battle is lost. It's a fundamental issue. It may be ignored in macroeconomics itself, that institutions and the framework that govern us, stay. Without change to those institutional systems or institutional framework, it doesn't matter how good the framework, the regime that you've put in place. It is a failed game. And frankly, we need to look as institution, and Comrade Alex and other leaders must be shifted back to the institutional framework. The rest will follow. I thank you.
Thanks, Comrade. Thanks, Comrade Redge. As I was saying earlier on, let me just do a share screen and hopefully it's going to work. I hope comrades are able to see. So on Saturday, we have this session with Comrade David Masondo, and there's a paper that he has been developing. And so he actually asked to have a platform to share this, and as part of the work of the ANC's Economic Transformation Subcommittee, and which is titled Post-COVID-19 Economic Reconstruction Lessons from the Great Depression and the Recession, and so it's on Saturday, the 20th at 4 o'clock. As soon as we finish this session today, we will actually finalize the actual creation of a new Zoom linkages, and then we will send, as we've been sending the others. And so we are hoping that the comrades who want to participate will actually be able to become part of this session. But we are quite excited about the possibility of this engagement that we're going to have on Saturday. Before we close, let me just find out if there's anything that maybe Comrade Alex would like to share before we close. Your mic is muted, Comrade Alex.
No, I'm saying you have said it all, comrades. Thank you very much to the Cruzani Institute for coordinating this dialogue, and thank you again to Comrade Redge and the other participants. Let's grow this as a big movement for change.
Thank you very much, comrades. And so hopefully, comrades, we will then see you all on Saturday at 4 o'clock with Comrade David Masondo. But as I mentioned, we are continuing with these webinars every Thursday. So next week, Thursday, at the same time, we will have also another webinar, likely with Comrade Chris, and also even the following ones. And so essentially, we have also just likely in the next coming weeks to have even Comrade Asker, who has also indicated a commitment to also make a presentation, so that broadly we can really create a composite engagement around these areas of macro economic policy. And so on that note, comrades, thank you very much for the participation, and so hopefully to see you on Saturday. And for those who won't see on Saturday, hopefully to see you again on Thursday next week. And we'd like to really appreciate Comrade Redge for this presentation. Quite insightful and really quite thought-provoking. And so, and Comrade Redge, by the way, he does write quite a bit on these things, even in the newspapers and also in some columns. And so you can be able to follow some of these ideas and be able to build up on the kinds of the things that he was actually presenting today. Thank you very much, comrades.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please take care and be well.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.